The distinguishing characteristic of economists is their intellectual arrogance, a phenomenon that is instilled in people who are persuaded that they have knowledge that is not accessible to the wider public. An example of this arrogance is provided by a statement by the most famous economist of the 20th century, John Maynard Keynes, who, when being told that there might be a shortage of buying power in the hands of the public, which was denying them the ability to live a decent life, said perhaps the solution would be for the government to bury cash in coal mines so people could go and dig it up and thereby supplement their income. This was undoubtedly a facetious remark by a snide and snobbish intellectual, but in any case, it indicates his contempt for ordinary people. Another example of the mad abstractionism of economists is a recent statement by the Governor of the Bank of Canada, who said that the Canadian economy is running at approximately 99% of full capacity. At the same time, his statisticians are saying that around 7% of the population are unemployed. I think most people would say that this represents unused capacity in the economy. If you look at the land of Canada, there are many fields that are uncultivated. This certainly looks like unused capacity. If you went to practically any manufacturer in the country and asked them if they could increase production, they would say, if there was demand for my product, certainly. So this too looks like unused capacity. So what in the world is the Governor of the Bank of Canada talking about? He's just using some perverse definition in order to create the impression that he is doing a good job. I'll get into more specific details shortly, but in general, the economists have failed in their responsibilities to society because they have completely ignored the progress of the industrial arts, which have brought us to a situation of such potential abundance that it would be the stuff of dreams for earlier generations. We have an enormous heritage of know-how and plant that can deliver goods in profusion to provide everyone with a decent living with less and less stress and effort on their part. Because the economists have not revealed the extent of this vast heritage, which has been contributed to for centuries, millennia even, by inventors, scientists, engineers, technicians, the financial power's control over society has been maintained and indeed constantly extended. So the economists have functioned basically as the handmaiden of the money power, and in this respect they have betrayed their fellow citizens. It is high time that they were exposed. In the past 200 and some years we have gone through several revolutions. We've been through the Industrial Revolution. We've been through the Information Revolution. We are now heavily embarked on the Robotics Revolution. These revolutions have multiplied human productive capacity many times over. I'm talking in many instances of hundreds or thousands of times over. And yet the basic way of existence of the ordinary man has hardly changed. In fact, as machines become more and more capable of doing work that required men in the past, human life has grown more precarious. This is simply because the principles of modern economists have thrown dust in the eyes of the population and obscured from them a true perception of the ocean of real wealth, if not actualized, certainly potential, in which they live. Instead of applying themselves to the challenge of ensuring that this abundance is transferred to the population, the economists have developed mad theories about full employment and favorable balances of trade, which in effect have robbed mankind of the vast potential benefits inherent in their technological heritage and the advantages that accrue from their cooperating in productive endeavor. As I've said, an instance of how the professional economists throw dust in the eyes of the public in order to prevent them from gaining a realistic sense of the immense wealth of economies blessed with automated and robotized economies is their definition of inflation. Conventional economists say that inflation is the difference between what prices were at a given point in the past and what they are currently, always on the assumption that it is normal for prices to be rising. The assumption underlying this position is that prices are or ought to be stable. But it's a self-evident fact that prices are not stable, but are in fact dynamic. They change according to factors of technology, the discovery of new sources of energy, all conceivable input costs. And the normal tendency of prices, looked at from this point of view, is that prices ought to be declining. So the orthodox economists say there is a baseline, and that inflation is the difference between this point on the baseline and this point on the baseline. The baseline being measured in units of time. But the plain fact is that prices, if they were reflecting reality, ought steadily to be declining. So the proper measure of inflation is not the difference between this point and this point, but it is that distance plus the distance between the baseline and where prices ought to be, which is lower, if all the factors of increased efficiency in production were taken into account. So with their completely unrealistic definition of inflation, it is impossible for the economists to see the reality of what is actually going on in the economy. But of course, this is very convenient because it disguises the burgeoning potential of our productive system. And the last thing that the financiers who are controlling this system want is for people to begin questioning why the productive system is so advanced, but the reality of their daily lives barely changes in the context of this tremendous technological progress. A further example of the falsity of orthodox economic theory is provided by their definition of a favorable balance of trade. And in this case, their theory is highly dangerous to the lives of millions of people. The economists say that you have a favorable balance of trade if you are exporting more goods out of your country than you are bringing in. Well, looked at realistically again, this is a very bizarre thesis. For in fact, what is being labeled as favorable is the removal from the ambit of the local population of real goods and resources that they could make use of. It is, of course, completely unjustifiable if the products being exported are actually in real demand within the exporting country. That is, that people, if they had the means of buying them, would do so rather than see them leave their shores. Again, it is an indication of the lack of support of domestic consumer buying power when there is a pressure constantly to be exporting goods in exchange for tokens, promises to pay, bits of paper called money. The grave danger in the economist's position is that it puts nations in a position of being increasingly competitive as they are driven to capture foreign markets more successfully than their rivals in this insane quest for a favorable balance of trade. This is a process that always increases in intensity and eventually concludes in more than a trade war, but actually military war, hot war, in which the lives of millions of the citizens of the populations involved in this competition are at risk. The obvious purpose of international trade is to acquire products that are hard for you to produce and to supply other countries with products you can produce easily that they are at a disadvantage in producing. So it should be just a matter of balance. It should never be a matter of outdoing your neighbor, beggaring your neighbor in this insane competitive atmosphere in which ultimately no one has ever been a winner. If the consuming function in societies was afforded proper support, then this unnatural pressure to export would be released and people could get along amicably without trying to beat their neighbors down in order to get an advantage in acquiring what the banks create out of nothing, namely financial credit. This is just another example of the Fabian socialists' imposition of an arbitrary model on society that has nothing to do with mankind's actual situation. And now I am going to say something that I hope you will concentrate on, because it's the key to all our misfortunes and limitations. The well-known economist John Kenneth Galbraith said that the way in which money is created is so simple that it repels the mind. As simple as it may be, only a small percentage of the population understand it, and of those who understand the method of money creation, only a tiny fraction understand its implications. Money is primarily bank credit. It is not coins and notes that you have in your wallet. Money is over 95% bank credit, and it comes into being through the act of a bank granting a loan. Every time a bank issues a loan, it thereby creates new money to the value of the loan. And every time a repayment of a loan is made, that money is cancelled out of existence. A large number of authorities for this statement can be produced, spanning well over a century. A recent one comes from the most authoritative economic source in the world, probably, the Bank of England, and was contained in a paper entitled The Modern Economy, produced by the bank in the year 2014. It states, in the modern economy, most money takes the form of bank deposits, but how those bank deposits are created is often misunderstood. The principal way is through commercial banks making loans. Whenever a bank makes a loan, it simultaneously creates a matching deposit in the borrower's bank account, thereby creating new money. This is how money comes into existence. It is created out of thin air on the supposition that the bank is the owner of the money, and it goes out of existence when the borrower repays his debt. A lot of so-called monetary reformers are aware of the fact that the banks create money out of thin air, but they do not carry their analysis through to understand the implications of this. The banks are creating money in a kind of cycle. The money is made, created, loaned out, and then it is withdrawn in the form of repayment of the loans, and when this occurs, that money is cancelled out of existence. It ceases to be available to the public. The only way the public can acquire its equivalents or more is to undertake to repay another loan to the banking system. The problem is that when the money is loaned, it generates costs in the productive system. When the money is repaid, if it is repaid previous to these costs being cancelled at the final stage of production, when the consumer pays for what has been produced, then that money is not available to the consumerate collectively to purchase the goods. This is what is meant by premature cancellation of credit. An illustration that should be easy to understand is a tradesman working on the construction of an apartment block. Every week or two, the tradesman will draw a salary. He'll take that salary and he will apply it to the repayment of his mortgage or a car loan or maybe an education loan. Anyway, a lot of the money will be going back into the banking system, and when it does, it is cancelled out of existence. But the effect of the salary of the employee is not simultaneously cancelled out of existence. The salary equivalent is being accounted by the builder of the apartment block and will be carried forward as a cost that will have to be recovered when the units in the building are sold. However, as I have just pointed out, that money has ceased to exist. So when the time comes for the apartment to be purchased by some member of the public, that money will have to be injected into the system in the form of fresh loans involving fresh costs that will flow forward into the future while the salaries of people engaged in economic activities are being vacuumed back into the banking system. Now this obviously is an illogical situation. It means that the community is creating goods for which there is no purchasing power equivalent in the hands of the population. There is a chronic shortage of buying power. This should make no sense to any normal citizen, but of course it makes a lot of sense to the banking system. The banking system treats money as a commodity, and the value of a commodity always increases when it's in scarce supply. So this premature cancellation of credit generates a chronic shortage of purchasing power in the hands of the community, thereby increasing the value of the credit that the banks create out of thin air. This demonstrates the folly of having the interests of private corporations, private concerns that are manufacturing the money supply being given precedence over the interests of the community as a whole. Money has a public function. It is essential in any modern economy to have an adequate supply of money. And if the supply is insufficient so that the banks have greater leverage over the public, this is clearly antisocial. So this premature cancellation of credit is a problem that requires immediate remediation. And any monetary reformer who is not drawing attention to it is missing the key element in the banker's armory of weapons against the general population. And what is the solution that the banks and the economists and the politicians propose for the fact that the population is chronically ill supplied with buying power? It's to fix people's attention on the need to save so that in their old age this scourge will not affect them too seriously. Now, money is not meant to be saved. Money is meant to be spent in coordination with the accumulation of production costs in the economy. The idea that money must be saved, of course, transfers responsibility for the mess the economy is in because of the mismanagement of the money supply by the banking system onto the shoulders of ordinary citizens. Our economic security does not lie in saving for the future. Saving merely handicaps the economy. Saving creates hardships for businesses and results in bankruptcies and takeovers. Our economic security lies in our inheritance of the enormous productive potential in the plant and know-how that we have coming down to us from previous generations. Unfortunately, the current banking system denies us access to this source of security. I'm speaking here of the masters of the financial system. There are hundreds of thousands of ordinary employees in that system,
who do not conceive of it as a tool for the centralization of power. However, there is no doubt that the people at the very top understand very well that they are starving the population of buying power in order to prevent it from accessing the abundance of the automated / robotic production system of our day. So it is imperative that this system be corrected to relieve these many competent persons who are experts in financing of their complicity in a dishonest system that should be run for the benefit of the public, but is not. Every economist who has been trained at university will understand the nature of money creation, and of course the next step from knowledge of this is to question whether money is being supplied in adequate amounts at appropriate places in order for economic functions to be completed. So there would not be many innocents among the community of professional economists. They need to be called out on this, and they also need to be showered with infinite distrust in future for their failure to rectify this inherently flawed system. As I've said, we are on a treadmill whose motor is running increasingly fast. And under the existing rules of finance, we cannot get off and we cannot slow down the engine. The gap between collective prices and consumer capacity to buy must be filled in one way or another. If we do nothing to rectify the shortage of buying power by filling the gap with direct payments to the population, the other solutions that will be offered are the traditional ones. We will have a swelling of bureaucracy, which distributes incomes without generating new production. We will have a mad pursuit of international markets, which generates bad international relations and eventually leads to military conflict. We will have intentional sabotage of production in the form of built-in obsolescence. We shall have hardship visited on businesses in the form of losses and bankruptcies. And we shall have increased borrowing on the part of governments and consumers in order for them to be provided with a temporary stopgap measure. But none of the traditional approaches to filling this gap solves the problem. In fact, it merely shifts the burden of it onto future generations. In order to solve it, we need to supplement the buying power in the hands of consumers. And this can be done in a couple of ways. You could make direct payments to all citizens in the form of a consumer dividend, a check that might be automatically entered into their bank accounts every month or quarter. Or you could have something akin to a reverse sales tax, where instead of prices being added to by the government, they would actually be reduced by merchants, and as compensation for their doing so, they would be remunerated out of a national credit creating account. The key thing is that this flow of additional consumer buying power must not take the form of debt, because debt is just an obligation that will fall due in the future. It solves nothing. These issues were thoroughly studied, analyzed, and expounded upon by an Anglo-Scottish engineer who looked at economics with an engineer's perspective in the early part of the 20th century. His name was Clifford Hugh Douglas, and the movement he founded was called social credit. Since the Second World War, there has been quite comprehensive censorship of any mention of social credit, and when it is mentioned, its precepts and proposals are invariably misrepresented. Douglas was thinking outside the box, and unfortunately, the box is the only place in which we are supposed to allow our thoughts to wander. The importance of understanding the matters C.H. Douglas was investigating cannot be exaggerated, for until we do, we will simply stumble from one stopgap measure to the next, eventually succumbing to major disasters, and most importantly, our access to the fruits of our fantastic cultural heritage will continue to be out of our reach.